Hello, everyone, and this is Jeffrey Geisner for the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group, and we're back again talking to Agnes Schipper about her terrific book. And Agnes, you're going to give us a little bit of more about the book and why you chose to write it, and then we're going to go and talk about how you became knowledgeable of the Holocaust, which you have a very unusual story in that regard. So why don't you tell our audience a little bit more about the book and why you wrote the book, and obviously mention the title.
Okay. Well, I wrote the book, Sabine's Odyssey, Hidden Child and Her Dutch Rescuers, really more to preserve the story for my children and my grandchildren. And it was very important for my mother, after her mother passed away, to find out more what happened to her brother, and to let me and my siblings and the grandchildren know the story. So she only opened up after her mother passed away, and she didn't have to abide by the promise never to discuss it.
Now, in the first episode, we learned that your parents were Catholic. Is that correct?
Yes,
right.
Correct.
And so they had Jewish ancestry, so they were caught in this dragnet of German Nazis, basically not caring at all whether your parents were Catholic. They felt that the Jewish lineage in there made them just as Jewish,
right.
And so they were in hiding. And let's talk about. And so they came to the United States, and your father's father was a doctor, or lawyer, and he stayed.
That's my mother's father.
My mother was a lawyer, sorry, and stayed in Germany. Became actually a Supreme Court justice, which was quite amazing. And but you were brought up Catholic, is that correct?
Correct.
So why don't we start there and talk about the fact that what your upbringing was like, because it's not normal for me to be able to interview someone in the Jewish Obligations of Memory podcast network that is Catholic. Right. So I think it's very, very relevant, and I think the journey that you took to becoming and taking on the Jewish faith is also really quite remarkable. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned in the first episode, my mother was raised Catholic. Her grandparents were considered Jewish. So as you mentioned, she got swept up with the anti-Semitism. But they raised us as Catholic. They moved to a town where they could get into the parochial school. So I'm a product of Catholic education until the first year of college. So myself, and I have 4 siblings, a sister and 3 younger brothers. I'm the oldest. We were all raised in the Catholic faith. First Holy Communion, confirmation. My brothers were altar boys. My parents remained devout Catholics for most of their life. My mother was Catholic. She didn't always agree with the church. My father was very much an old line Catholic.
So your parents were Catholic, but they were caught up in having to hide, and they were caught in the Nazi movement of murdering Jews, and they were forever. I think you said 9 places that your mother had to hide to survive, and your father was in the Dutch resistance fighting the Nazis, even though he was Catholic. So it's kind of an interesting just thought process there. So growing up in your mother and your father's home, how did they deal with their situation? I would call it, in my other world, I would call it survivor trauma. Well, they have survivor trauma, maybe. So I want to ask you, did your parents have survivor trauma, even though they were Catholic?
My mother definitely did. And it's the loss of her only sibling and the awful circumstances under which it happened. She was home alone after school. Her father had gone to Utrecht to try to get visas. Her mother, she doesn't know whether she was shopping, so she was home alone when two young men approached her and followed her up to her parents' apartment and asked for her brother by name. And they were plain clothes, young, looked about her brother's age. The fact that they asked for him by name. And she said, I don't know if he's home. He lives in a room, in an apartment next door. So the young men, she assumed that they were members of the Catholic acolyte group. So her brother was quite religious and wanted to become a priest. So she assumed that they were, and they were fluent in Dutch, so she assumed they were fellow members of this group her brother belonged to. So they followed her downstairs, and in between the two, in the pension where they lived, there were two essentially apartment buildings. And on the bottom was the where the cook and the kitchen was. So the two young men asked if they knew if Andreas was there or home, and they shook their head. And my mother didn't know what that meant. And she said, but there is his bike. And they went upstairs and arrested him. And it was only after they told her that they were taking her brother to Uterpestraat, which is where the Gestapo headquarters were, that she realized that she had helped essentially Dutch agents for the Gestapo capture her brother. And although she understood intellectually, she was a child, she was 14, she was always told to tell the truth. She said someone should have warned her. And I think she said this gnawed at her entire life, because she thought he might have been able to escape across the rooftops as other young men did, evading capture by the Gestapo. So that she carried that guilt with her,
So
and it haunted her.
Did you feel that as a child
No,
growing up in their home?
no. I think what she did is she kept extremely busy. She was raising 5 children. She was active in the League of Women Voters. She was always knitting, always busy. And I don't think until the end of her life, and we're talking her last year, age 90, when she kind of started disconnecting, that, and my brothers have discussed this, it's almost as if this lava came bubbling forth, and all the traumas really haunted her in her last days. She started having dreams that her brother was looking for her, that he had escaped. And very late, she thought her brother wouldn't recognize her because she had grown so old, and she became extremely distraught. And it was very hard to calm her down.
What about your father? Did he have any traumas on his side?
He did. And my mother was much more verbose and easy to talk to. My father was the typical silent Dutchman, very hard to speak and interview. And it was only extremely late in his life, we're talking 90s, when a Dutch historian contacted my brother because he was writing about the uncle who was captured by the Dutch Nazis, and he died in a concentration camp in Sachsenhausen. And this historian felt he was like an unknown hero, and his story should be told, and there should be some memorial honoring him. So he contacted my brother, and my brother interviewed my father. And that's when he first learned that he was the last one to see his uncle alive. He had gone to the police station and saw the Nazis leading his uncle out, and he clearly had been tortured. He could barely walk, and there were tears in his eyes. He also witnessed, and this again came out late in life, when my brother saw a documentary about his cousins who were very active in the resistance. And he was part of a resistance cell called the Mandrill, and they would meet and they would get weapons dropped in parachutes by the Allied pilots. They'd have to get them in the middle of the night, hide the parachutes, hide the weapons, etc. And near the end of the war, 2 German soldiers came to the house where they were all meeting. And they knew that it was what they were doing obviously was illegal. They also had weapons hidden in the farm. And for the survival of the group, they had to kill the 2 soldiers. And my father said it was the most awful thing he had ever witnessed, because they were young. They said, we have, I have a wife and children. And it was very traumatic for him to have witnessed that, but he never spoke about it until literally prodded at the end of his life. My mother was more open.
So in our last episode, you mentioned that you were 20
Yes.
when you learned from a relative, I think in England.
An elderly aunt, yeah.
So why don't you just quickly recap that story, and then I'm going to ask you questions beyond that.
Sure. So I studied abroad my junior year at the London School of Economics, and I have quite a few relatives in Europe. And I looked up my Tante Ella.
Well, we have you a little bit frozen here. Okay. Okay.
So the story of how I discovered that I had Jewish ancestors is that I looked up an elderly aunt. I was 20 years old, studying in London at the London School of Economics, and I looked up an elderly aunt, Tante Ella Fröhlich. They had left Germany and gone to England after Kristallnacht. And after the meal that she treated in a very nice restaurant, she treated me to a meal, and then we went to her very nice apartment afterwards and started talking. And she asked me if I knew about Andreas, that's the name of my mother's brother. And I said, yes, I knew about him, and I knew that he had been taken away and died in a concentration camp. And she said they took him because he was Jewish. And that I did not know. And I tried to hide my surprise, but I think she caught on that it was news to me. She wasn't aware it was this secret, and it was a promise made by my grandmother never to discuss or talk about the Jewish heritage, because they didn't want the curse of the quote curse of a Jewish heritage to haunt another generation. So that was my first inkling that I had Jewish ancestors.
So what was the next thing you did?
I was actually very pleased by it, because I thought, oh, now my history goes back to BC, thousands of years earlier. And I went back home and back to my home in London, got very busy with exams, and I decided I needed to ask my mother to explain why was this kept a secret from me.
And I remember you saying your mother was around 41 or so at the time.
She was 41 when I essentially confronted her and say, why didn't you tell me?
From London, or directly when you were at
home?
When
I traveled the entire summer, and then when I got back home is when I had a quiet moment with her. Pretty hard to do in the family with 5 kids. I confronted her and asked her why she didn't tell me. And
what about the other 5? Were you
ultimately they all found out.
Okay.
Ultimately they all found out, but none of us grew up knowing that. None of us.
And what did your mother, how did your mother respond to your questions? Like, what kind of questions did you ask your mother?
She explained that this was not her choice, but she felt obliged to honor the wishes of her mother. So I kind of understood that, and I had visited my grandparents during that summer, and I just had this sixth sense it would be extremely upsetting for them if I would start grilling and questioning them about it. So I literally waited until I could get back home, because I felt my mother should be the one to explain this. So the downside is I never got to interview my grandparents. I found out through my mother some of their experience and through my own research. And yeah, I lost a number of relatives in the Holocaust. Had never had any idea about it.
And what did what did your other siblings, once they found out and you began talking about the situation with your siblings, how did that all kind of work itself into
Well,
this?
by that time, I was away at college. My sister was away at college. I was across the country, so there wasn't a lot of discussion. I mean, I mentioned it to my siblings, but we didn't really discuss it a lot. It was just, that's one of the facts of our background.
Okay,
So I
so
don't
was there any actions that you took once you knew that you had a Jewish background?
obviously,
Did you start researching the religion? Did you start wanting to trace genealogy? Did you want to build a family tree? I mean, I could say there's probably a dozen things you may have done, but I'm interested to hear from you.
well, the first thing I did was find some time. In 1998, I visited the Mauthausen camp with my mother. And that is when I really got the details of her story, the chronology and where she all went, and how hard it was for her. She wanted to see where her brother spent his last days.
And
so I traveled.
How old was she at that time?
She would have been 70. This is 1998. She's born in 21.
Okay.
27 rather. So she would have been 71.
Okay.
When she went to the Mauthausen camp in Austria.
Was she interested to go, or she was hesitant to go?
Oh no, she very much wanted to go. She very much wanted to go. And so she wrote to the Dutch embassy trying to find, the word Odyssey is also her search for information about her brother, because they learned about his death verbally from an elderly woman who also lived in the same pension as they did. And my grandmother couldn't bear to go to the Jewish council, the Joodse Raad, where they would publish the names of all the young men who had perished. And week by week, these deaths came in. At the time my mother's brother was arrested, nobody had heard of death camps. They'd heard of concentration camps where people were treated badly, but ultimately released. This was the first indication that these were not just concentration, these were death camps. So my mother and her parents found out when this elderly lady came into the room and said, he's on the list. And that would have been early November 1941. So after my grandmother passed away, she really wanted to research what happened to her brother. She wanted to find some wartime records with his name. So she contacted the Dutch embassy. She contacted the Institute for War Documentation in the Netherlands. And she was put in contact with, it's called the Vriendenkring. It's the friendship circle of relatives who had family die in Mauthausen. And they made an annual trip, and his name was added to the Dutch memorial in 1996. In 1998, she finally felt well enough to go visit and see the memorial and see the camp.
I'll go back to when he was taken to Mauthausen. Well, he was picked up by the Dutch collaborators with the Nazis. What was he doing that he got on the radar of these Nazis? Do you know?
Yeah, he wasn't doing anything. In the Netherlands, they had in February, they had what's the first razzia, which was a roundup of young Jewish men, just random men off the street, because there had been some act of sabotage. So of course you're going to blame young Jewish men. So they rounded up very violently, random, some 300 men, the German police, very heavy-handed, and took them away, and they ended up in Buchenwald, and some of them ended up in Mauthausen. There was a huge nationwide strike in reaction to the brutality of and the randomness of these arrests. So for about 4 or 5 months, nothing. And then there was another Dutch act of sabotage. A bomb went off in front of an officers' club, and a soldier was injured somewhere near a radio tower. So the Nazis decided to focus on German Jewish immigrants. and just rounded up some 300 German Jewish refugees. And they had gone to the Jewish Council for the addresses. So it was essentially, they were hostages in retaliation for an act of sabotage.
But he was Catholic, so how did he get on that list?
Because he still had the big J. He was Jewish because of his ancestry.
His paperwork had the J.
Had the J, yeah.
Right.
Everyone had to register. Everyone.
And you have that with you, so maybe you can share, since we're talking about it right now, the paperwork, your mother's paperwork.
Oh, my mother's paperwork.
So you can share that, and
the picture is greatly faded, but everyone who was Jewish had to register. Actually, everyone in Holland had to carry an ID card, but if you were Jewish, your ID card had a big J.
Right.
And because she was a refugee, or that means foreigner, so she's registered with the big J. And that's her initial Jewish registration card with her address. I don't know how visible this is, and her
it's good
fingerprints. So he would have had that, and his name would have been registered with the Jewish Council, which was set up by the Nazis to administer, quote, Jewish affairs. So I don't think the council probably provided the names. I don't think they knew that this is what they were going to do. They were going to apparently told them they rounded up to some work camps. They didn't disclose that these were going to be hostages sent to a death camp.
Right. So coming back to your 20s, and you're now post knowing that you have Jewish connections, right, Jewish blood in your family tree. When did you meet your spouse? How did you meet your spouse?
College. We took some classes together. Political science.
In England, or where did you go to
school? No, I'm back at New York University in my final year.
Okay.
England was my Jewish year. I met him the final year of my college.
Okay.
And that's where we met. And then he followed me out to California.
Okay. And why did you go to California?
Because I wanted to get a degree in journalism. I have a master's degree from UC Berkeley in journalism. And he was at that point, he thought he was going to go to medical school. And he said, well, you can't be married in medical school. And I was.
Oh, we lost your connection again. So I'm sorry. Right there. So you were mentioning how you got to California.
Yeah, I met a person who became my first husband at New York University. I decided to go to graduate school out in California. He stayed in New York and ultimately came out to California.
So we married. So you have a journalism degree. What was your career?
I started out trying to think of my first job was in journalism, was doing videos for the medical school. And then I got a job for several newspapers in Southern California. These are suburban newspapers.
Did you have a passion for some type of work in the reporting area, or?
I was just an overall general reporter. I have to say I enjoyed reporting on the courts a lot. So, but school board, you name it, political.
So that goes back
a little bit.
Does that go back to your mother's father?
No, well, maybe in retrospect, going to law school, I definitely thought about him, but that was after a journalism career.
So you went to law school after your journalism career?
Right. So I worked a number of years as a reporter and ultimately as an editor. And then we moved to Minnesota just as the afternoon paper was folding. So there were no journalism jobs. And I decided I would go to law school because I enjoyed reporting on the courts. And I thought I would be like Linda Greenhouse, kind of specialize in that. And I got sidetracked into practicing law for 25 years.
Where, in Minnesota?
Initially in Minnesota, then North Carolina, then back to Minnesota.
Well, you have again a commonality because I used to live in Minnesota from
Right.
2005 to 2019. So where were you living in Minnesota?
So I have to do this. 2005, I would have been in Rochester, Minnesota, and then in 2008, I started working in Rochester, which is where the Mayo Clinic is, and then spending my weekends in Minneapolis.
And okay, and so where did you live in Minneapolis for all those Minneapolis friends that I have listening?
If you know where the Walker Art Institute is,
Absolutely.
Groveland, right down the street from there.
Yeah,
and
of
a
course.
hot rod with a fabulous view, absolutely
Oh,
fabulous.
you were in that building right
Yeah.
behind my wife when she was
on the other side of Lindale, Hennepin.
Yeah, I think I know that building you're talking about. My wife,
Yeah.
when we first moved to Minneapolis, she worked for the builder who made that building.
Oh, really?
So it's a really small world.
Yeah.
So you got married when?
Mhm. In 1973 in Berkeley.
Okay, and so I'm interested to talk about your journey to Judaism. So maybe we can you can tell us all about how that all took place.
Well, by the time I met my first husband, I was no longer an observant Catholic. And I guess I don't think religion necessarily determines how honorable or moral you are. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. And when we had children, I was fine with raising them Jewish.
Was he Jewish?
He was Jewish,
Okay.
bar mitzvah and everything.
Mhm.
And part of it, I felt that, Hitler subtracted 6 million Jews. I've added 4 more back into the tribe. So it was really more,
That's very nice.
I felt it was more important to my then spouse that they be raised Jewish. I didn't feel strongly.
So you're how many children do you have?
I have 4.
Okay, and their ages are now, what ages are they now?
Oh, gee. So they were born in 77, 79, 81, and 86.
Okay.
So they're all in late 30s, early 40s now.
And they have families, or some do and some don't?
Yes. My oldest daughter, her husband is Jewish, and she has 2 sons. They're being raised Jewish. My second daughter's husband is, I would say, probably agnostic, not religious, but she is raising the children Jewish. So I have 3 more grandsons, only grandsons. And then my son is not married. And then my youngest daughter is also, she's engaged now, but we'll see.
Congratulations.
If there are any other grandchildren, I would love to have a daughter.
How old is she?
She's born in, she must be 36.
Okay. And so, but are your children, when they grew up, in what respect? Were they raised Catholic?
No, they were raised Jewish.
They were raised Jewish.
So
when you say your oldest daughter, I kind of caught when you said your oldest daughter her husband is Jewish, they're raising the kids Jewish. Does she consider herself Jewish?
Oh, yeah. All my children would say they are Jewish.
Okay.
They all had 3 bat mitzvahs and 1 bar mitzvah. They went to Sunday school.
Very nice.
Seders, all the customs.
And so they were brought up in Berkeley? Okay.
And Los Angeles, Minneapolis, Chapel Hill.
Okay, so which
Rochester.
synagogue in Minneapolis did you belong to?
Temple Israel.
My wife was the chief operating officer of Temple Israel. I don't know if you knew that. So she spent about 5 years there working as the chief CFO, COO, and we still are members of Temple Israel, and we stream the high holidays from Temple Israel frequently. So we have a lot of connections. In fact, my wife, who I've married 36 years plus, She's going back to Minneapolis for 2 weeks, just starting next Tuesday, and she's reconnecting with the mishpocha that we have in Minneapolis. So it's she hasn't been back to Minneapolis since 2019 because of COVID, and so she's very excited. So great stop here. We're going to end our second episode of the Obligations of Memory podcast with Agnes Schipper. And we'll be back for our third episode, so stay tuned.